debate team, the winner of the debating championship, hosted Union alongside the Debaters Council and previously ranked among top 5 best speakers in the country, Mr. Visura Padenia.
As the second judge, we have debate coach of Ananda College, Colombo 10, member of the Circuit Development Committee under the Debaters Council, part of the National Pool for Debaters for the year 2022, debated for Methodist College A team for the years 2021-2023, 7 top 15 speaker ranks in local debate tournaments in the year 2022, member of the Methodist College debate team that was ranked among the top 4 schools in country by the Debaters Council in the year 2022. Please welcome our second judge, Mrs. Rachel Kramer.
As the third college debating team, coach of Mahamaya College debate team, and also the breaking associator in international tournaments, including Pakistan Pre-WSGC 2024 and South Asia Schools Debating Championship 2024, Mr. Shakib Mohideen.
To come and take their seats.
Team of DS Senana along with his team member Didumika Piris.
Representing the opposing team for the debate, we have the English Debating Society of Anula Vidyalaya, Captain Mihiligala Hitiava, along with the debaters Tumansa Karuna Ratna, Tisari Rodrigo, and Aditya Fernando. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, esteemed judges, today we gather to discuss about a topic of significant importance.
The topic is this house believes that strong dictatorships in the Middle East are better than weak democracies. Hope that both teams will give their best to prove their opinions and will make this debate more compelling. Before we get into the debate, let me outline the rules and regulations briefly. You will only be given 7 minutes for substantial speeches, and a bell will be rung at the first and 6th minutes of the substantial speeches to let the members know starting and ending times respectively. You will be drowned out if you speak for more than 7 minutes and 15 seconds. For the replay speeches, there will only be 4 minutes. Most importantly, the decision of judge panel will be the final. As we all got to know the rules and regulations, let's move on to the debate. We wish best of luck to both teams and may you approach this opportunity with confidence and clarity. So let's begin with the first speaker from the preposition team. I invite the first speaker of preposition team to, to make the case. You have 7 minutes for your opening statement. Your time starts now. Can you please restart the time?
fragile power. For an example, countries like the United Arab Emirates are a strong dictatorship in the Middle East, which have a solid sense of power and control, while countries like North Korea have a very fragile sense of power. That is a difference between this debate against Middle Eastern dictatorships and other dictatorships. Our burden for you to prove within this debate is to show you as to in which comparative people living within these countries will get benefited. Two main arguments. First argument then, and the role of the state. Within the first argument, the role of state, this is my premise. The premise of the argument is to say that democracy shouldn't be supported just for the sake of the principle. You need to uphold three main key principles of democracy for democracy to properly be upheld and for the people to benefit off of democracy. First principle then, participation. Secondly, representation. Thirdly, accountability. I'm going to be giving you three main layers of analysis as to show you why like these levels of democracy and basic values are not properly upheld. Firstly, three main reasons. First reason, leaders within these countries work for personal gain. We tell you, leaders that are elected within weak democracies only work and mainly work in most cases for personal gain. That is why these countries are characterized by developing countries within these certain nations. And we tell you, these leaders often profit of the aid that they get for the country's development, and that is why these countries are weak in governance. But secondly, we tell you these leaders are often uneducated because the people who elect these leaders aren't properly informed of what is happening within the country. Or two, we tell you these people coerce citizens living within the country to vote for them by giving them short-term materialistic benefits. Thirdly, government, economy, and democracy in itself are somewhat broken within these countries. Hence, these countries have leaders who work for personal gain, uneducated leaders. Hence, like the three main rules of like democracy, participation, representation, and accountability aren't properly upheld. Let me impact you in this my second argument, but then the two main effects of like these three principles being failed. Firstly, we tell you higher corruption within this country happens. What does this look like? This looks like media control still happening within the country to an extent. This looks like economic unrest. It looks like healthcare benefits not being provided to citizens. It looks like coercion within the country and coercion within the country and for people living within the country. We tell you the Middle East is a better comparative. Why is this the case? Firstly, the idea of benevolence existing for these Middle Eastern leaders. We tell you in status quo, these leaders of like Middle Eastern nations are seen within the sense of benevolency. That is to say, they're held up to a good regard because they do certain good things for countries for their own development. They might do this development for their own benefit to keep up their like good image, but we tell you net good still does happen towards people living within the country because they do a certain level of good towards the city to the country to uphold their image. They still do certain level of good people living within the country. So we tell you the net good still exists on side proposition. Then we impact you in the second argument. We tell you the benefits that are derived from these like, principles being not upheld is still better on our comparative. If I move on, I'll take up AOI. Yeah.
If don't you think that even if democracies are weak, they still have more room to grow than strong dictatorships?
I tell you, no. Weak democracies are in itself weak for a main reason. They have, again, I give you three main reasons as to why they are weak. They have bad leaders, they have uneducated and broken systems. We tell you they are less likely to develop and they're less likely to gain traction because they can't get themselves off the ground because of these reasons that they go to right now. I'll explain this in my second argument. Second argument then on better living standards for people. Premise, impact benefit for people on our comparative is better. Firstly, then, as to why Middle Eastern dictatorships serve people better. Three main key reasons. Countries are wealthier. Secondly, these countries are incentivized to serve people better. And thirdly, these countries are turning to be more progressive. Explained as as to why countries are more wealthier. We give you three main reasons. These countries have a better economy, these countries have better resources, and overall these countries have a powerful sense of middle class living within the country for them to grow and develop. We tell you that these countries have a good sense of development, hence these countries are wealthier. Because these countries are wealthier, people have more money because they have more job opportunities, they have more ways of getting income. In itself, we tell you people live better within these countries because these countries are developed. But secondly, I tell you why these leaders are incentivized to do better within these countries. Firstly, because I tell you for the Middle Eastern dictatorships, the global reputation is key. We tell you what they depend on is the global reputation that they have. It's important that they have good reputation because they need to sell their oil, they need to have tourism within the country, and for these that these leaders do because of this. We tell you that within because of the power that they have, and these Western nations often have higher ties with them comparative to weak democracies, and that is to say these are observed very well. These are looked down on, looked up to very well. So in itself, the global outlook like these people have are higher. So the incentive for these Middle Eastern countries to act better, do better, and not necessarily screw things up is way higher on both sides. Then the global outlook, it's less likely that you are called out in weak democracies. But we tell you, if you do a certain wrong action within like these dictatorships, you are going to get called out. Hence, there are more incentive to do good within the country. But thirdly, we tell you, we impact this on our third layer of analysis and say these countries are more progressive because of the Western influence that they gain. We tell you international influence is way higher for these dictatorships because international countries care more about these dictatorships because of the power that they have. Hence, their economy, their tourism, and their social like modernization happens to a higher level. This looks like Kuwait like letting people who aren't married live together. This looks like Saudi Arabia letting females drive in 2023. Modernization is happening, and it is real. Then, as to comparative, what they look like, they have a worse of economy, they have worse of living conditions, and they have worse of like influence of leaders within their country. Within this debate, Anil has to prove to me as to why they have like better living standards for people side with side proposition. Thank you for the house's time.
I now invite the first speaker from the opposition team.
Test. We will be answering POIs by a raise of hand, and my pronouns are she, her. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. To open the case for side opposition today, we would bring three major arguments for this House on today's motion, right? Two of these arguments would be brought up by me, and the other argument would be brought up by my second speaker. And before we dive into this whole arguments for this House today, we would first like to rebut all the arguments brought by the first speaker of side proposition. Now, first of all, they think it's better and it's like it's more important to have a good reputation in the country for the country than prioritizing people's human rights, right? So the first speaker of side proposition came up and claimed that having a good reputation is far more important than prioritizing human rights, right? So basically, that's the whole issue with a dictatorship, right? And also, they said that a dictatorship in Middle East is way more different than dictatorships in other countries. But how is it different? There are so many issues in a country with dictator, even in the Middle East. It's basically the same thing. They just know how to censor their ways and do it in a way that wouldn't be in a way that wouldn't make the people from the outer world get involved in the country's economy, right? So now moving on to the first argument of this House. Now,
POI, ma'am.
Yeah, go ahead.
Explain as to me why a country with a good reputation would not uphold human rights. If they don't uphold human rights, how would they have good reputation?
Can you repeat it, please?
Explain to me as to why a country with a good reputation won't uphold good levels of human rights. If they don't uphold good levels of human rights, how would they have a good reputation?
So basically, human rights always comes first, and in a democracy, they always prioritize human rights. But in a dictatorship, they never prioritize human rights, and also a dictator always thinks benefits, right? Now, I hope that answered your POI. Now, as to why, now as a side opposition, we are not saying that weak democracies don't have issues, right? We are not claiming that in a democracy issues doesn't exist, right? We are saying, look, issues do exist, but in a democracy, we just have a better way of solving these issues. But in a dictatorship, there's not a good way to solve these issues, right? As to prove my claim, I would like to say, in a democracy, there are institutions, and all these democracy countries pass different mechanisms, right? And these different people in the country, they always have institutions to turn up to, right? There are civil organizations, there are different institutions, there's the police, but but so they, if something happens to them, they always have somebody to contact, right? But in a dictatorship, if we compare their side of the case to our side of the case, in a dictatorship this does not exist. And also, in in a democracy, we have a lot of principles that helps to keep the country stable and also prioritize the human rights, right? So basically, I would say one of the main principles of a democracy is the Bill of Rights. Basically, Bill of Rights is like this list of characteristics, rights of basic human beings, and that does not exist in a dictatorship, right? And also, now another main principle in a democracy is voting, right? And now I'm going to say represent the different communities in a country, right? Now, in a country there are so many communities, and in these communities, like for an example, there are homosexual people, there are people with different religious beliefs, and they need a community and they need someone to represent them. But in a dictatorship this doesn't happen, right? For an example, if let's say a dictator is very homosexual, right? A dictator in the Middle East is very homosexual, then he would neglect the people, neglect the homosexual people living in the country, and he would show to the world that homosexual is a bad thing and it's like some sort of sin, right? So everybody needs somebody to represent them, right? So moving on, to understand the logic of to understand the mind of a dictator, we must understand two simple logics, and these are: when all the power of one country goes the hand of one person, they will always end up committing crimes, no matter how kind of a person, and no matter how much they think of the country and the government, they will always end up committing crime. And more freedom means more crimes, and there's no system to regulate them, right? So basically, they have some tricks. The another logic is they have some tricks to control the country, right? So basically what they do is they always manipulate people. And how do they manipulate people? So they manipulate people by so they basically start conflicts against weak neighboring countries, right? Why do they start conflicts against weak neighboring countries? They start conflicts against weak neighboring countries because they know they can always win this war, right? When they win this conflict, the people in the country are going to think like this person is some sort of a god, and going to treat him like it's going to help the person to be in power and to legitimate their power, right? So this is a trick of the dictator. And also another thing is they will always focus on, and they will always hit on people's sensitive points. Now in Middle East, a lot of people are very religious, right? So if a religious dictator comes to the power, they would always this religious not right now, thank you. Religious dictator will always think about the country's religious, right? So the people are going to help they are not going to do anything against this dictator, right? So basically, a definition of democracy changes depending on the people living in the country, right? A democracy is solely dependent on the people living in the country. And to prove my point, in the Sri Lanka's the first sentence of the Gazette in Sri Lankan Democratic Government, it clearly states that uh, in a country, the democratic country is solely based on its people, right? So if the people in the country are strong or weak, that basically changes the definition of if of democracy being strong or weak. For an example, if we say in a normal society, conflicts happen, right? When a conflict happen, human rights might get abused, and when this person human rights get abused, he will basically, if he's a strong person, he would go and contact the police or other institutions that are in a democracy, right? But if this person is weak, he wouldn't show up, and that makes the institution strong or weak, right? So basically, depending on the people living in the country, if they are strong and they are weak, the definition of democracy always changes, right? And also, now moving on to the second argument for our side of the house today, economy, right? Why are so many foreign countries are attracted to the countries in Middle East? The first reason is oil resources, right? They have the oil resources, so that all the countries are attracted to them, right? The second reason is basically they know they have only one leader, right? So it's easy to manipulate this person and easy to change what they think, right? So basically, the best example for this is the Trinco Bay this whole thing that happened in Sri Lanka, right? The China was like, okay, look, we are gonna give you some money, and in return, you guys need to give the Trinco Bay for us for like taxes or whatever. And Ranil Wickremesinghe, the president of the country at this time, he was like, okay, you know what, I'm going to give the bay. But then the people in the country, they saw the future and they were like, you know, this is going to create such a bad thing for the it's going to be such a bad decision for the country, right? So basically the opposing political parties and also the majority of the people living in the country, because they said no, Ranil Wickremesinghe wasn't able to sell this harbor to China, right? And this, if Ranil Wickremesinghe was a dictator, then basically he would have already sold the bay to China, right? But since since he's not a dictator, and since it's a democratic government, we were able to change this thing from happening, right? So basically, uh, that's how it is. And also, sorry, give me a second. So, and there are so many other reasons why we as side opposition oppose to the motion. So, Your Honor, we oppose as side opposition. Thank you.
Now I invite the second speaker from the proposition team to make the case.
Check. Right. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. We're asking two main questions within my speech. Firstly, on which country has a better system. Secondly, on like the people that are living in these countries and as how we benefit them to a high extent. First question then on which country has a better system. And the first contention that they give us in their first in like a POI is that they say that weak democracies have more room to go. I have three main responses to this. But firstly, I want to talk about the leaders of these countries look like. Because these are corrupt leaders who most importantly care more about their own personal gains. That's what corruption means, is that they care less about the democratic principles and are more likely to care about like their own personal gains in terms of the monetary benefits that they gain. And therefore these leaders are more likely not going to care about like the betterment or development towards the country, but much rather getting more money towards themselves within these nations. But secondly, what these countries look like, or what these big democracies look like, is that they have frequent riots against the government. What this causes is a higher level of instability. And what this instability causes is it pretty much like, prevents any chance of these countries developing in the future, because it's very hard for you to get out of that instability in the first place.
But thirdly, I want to from both these higher off on our side to a high extent. The reason for this is because these Middle Eastern countries are extremely rich and like already have like a stable level of financial growth, which means that it's much easier for these countries to develop to a high extent. But I want to look at what these countries look like, because these are countries like the UAE, these are countries like Saudi Arabia, which already have a high level of development. So even if on their side we concede to the fact on our very worst case that they can have some level of development, since we are already like some of the like most powerful countries in the world, we believe that our comparative is better even on their best case. But then second, they tell us that these dictators work for their own betterment. I have three main responses. But firstly, I say that these people are incentivized to support their people, because at the point at which these dictators don't do that, Westernized nations are going to call them out. And the reason for this is that these Middle Eastern dictatorships have a higher PR with Western nations in the first place. But secondly, I want to know what these nations look like, because these are nations that have been striving and prospering in terms of their development. And at that point, it's extremely unjustified for them to say that these people don't serve for their people. At the point at which these countries are extremely developed and like some of the richest countries in the world, it's safe to assume that they've done a good job with their jobs in the first place. But thirdly, I want you to look at the point on how manipulation is higher off on our side. But I want you to look at this. With corrupt leaders, what they try to do is manipulate these countries in the first place. What they try to do is get the votes from the people in like the elections are closer, because they understand that they don't have the capacity to be re-elected because they've already failed the people to a high extent. And therefore, things like manipulation are severely high off on their side to a huge extent. But then they tell us the Middle Eastern dictatorships are similar to other dictatorships and that there's no difference except for like the manipulation. I have three main responses. But firstly, like they tell us that these countries are oil rich and have like a lot of money, which means it's much better off for the standards or like living standards for the people, which they severely mistouch within this debate. But secondly, I want you to show these countries have a better reputation with westernized nations, which means that they're going to be held accountable at the point at which they like cause atrocities. I want to bring up an example for this. So the point at which in the Qatar World Cup they were making stadiums and like they were called out for like people like people like being used as slaves. At the point at which they did that, then they like cut down on it, and like the world like completely had like backlash on them in the first place. And therefore, this influence is going to incentivize these people to not do these things in the first place. But then, thirdly, I want to get set up because these countries or like Middle Eastern dictatorships are like made out of like their cultural principles and values, and thus they have a higher or like stronger like stronger power in comparison to other